The Swedish government provides us NGO funding through a major international development group, SIDA, S-I-D-A. They had an in-house magazine that for a number of issues featured me with a picture of a spider web, me and NGO Monitor, where as if I was controlling Mr. Netanyahu, the entire Israeli government, and the American government. One of the major events that happened in the history of Human Rights Watch was that the founder, Robert Bernstein, wrote an article in the New York Times in 2009 to denounce the organization run by Ken Roth, which he had lost control of because he had retired. I sat with Robert Bernstein for a number of times over a couple of years going through the information. He said to me, I was told that everything you say is incorrect, or maybe even he used stronger language than that. But when I showed him, they saw that everything that was there was correct. Why am I telling you all this? Because there are individuals who will listen to the information.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. Since October 7th, Israel has been saying it's fighting for humanity on the front lines of humanity, but in the information war, it's Israel's own humanity that is being called into question. And that charge is being led by NGOs with open ideological agendas that pass themselves off as great defenders of humanity. And how can they not? With names like Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, how can they possibly be wrong? But they have been active combatants in the information war against Israel, amplifying and driving some of the worst lies and propaganda against Israel, divorced from their own principles. Failing to stand up for the victims of October 7th, failing to fight for the hostages, even allegedly taking funding from the Saudis and Qataris. Accusing Israel of atrocities while failing to recognize the human rights of its civilians to sleep safe from the threat of rocket fire, turning a blind eye to Hamas's own abuse of human rights. Today's guest is pushing back because if sunlight is the best disinfectant, then shedding light on these NGOs' funding and dark practices should expose all the dirt. Professor Gerald Steinberg, founder and president of NGO Monitor, has spent his life challenging the global system of anti-Israel NGOs. NGO Monitor has worked for years to hold the watchdogs accountable and warn Israel's supporters of the damage that they are doing by abusing the banner of human rights, waging a propaganda war against Israel behind such seemingly innocuous names. Israel is losing the information war thanks in no part to the political activities of these biased NGOs. What can Israel do to turn the tide? Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon.
What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this? Where does this go?
Professor Gerald Steinberg, welcome to State of a Nation.
Thank you.
You've been monitoring the NGO universe for how many years now?
About 23.
23? I think that's sufficient expertise. Looking at the way that these NGOs have been political actors that have been waging certain campaigns against Israel, I'm wondering, since October 7th, have you been surprised by the way that they have been acting, or are they doing pretty much playing to script?
I'm not sure I'd use the word surprised, not even shocked, certainly not shocked. They have elevated significantly. They've amplified the same messaging, the same propaganda, the same basic approach, methodology to attacking, to demonizing Israel that they've developed for most of that 20 years. I originally started to do this and I said, okay, I'll do this for 3 years. This was after the infamous Durban UN conference on the elimination of racism, where all the themes...
Which became the Durban conference on the elimination of Israel.
But all the same themes that we hear now were trotted out there and have been amplified, developed since then. So they had plenty of practice. They had practice in the end of 2008-9 that led to the Goldstone report, which some people may remember, 2012, 2014, 2021, all the, particularly the Gaza, but not just Gaza, conflicts and clashes that have taken place. They use the same messaging, but they are much more vocal, much more able to develop their points into not just a Palestinian niche, but much wider than that. And we see that on campuses. We see that, of course, in the UN and everywhere else. So it's a major amplification, but there's really nothing substantially new here.
I will in this episode to try to map out the NGO universe, work out what the major actors are, what damage they've been doing to Israel, how they've been involved in the conflict. But before we get specifically to the October 7th war and the situation in Gaza, I want to have a look at what is happening in the United States, on campuses, what we call the tentifada. People will have noticed many of the identikit tents on university campuses, raising questions. Who's funding it, or are these simply the most popular tents and the first search option that pops up on Amazon? A large-scale movement coordinated across America to blacken Israel's name, accuse it of genocide, to chant from the river to the sea, that hasn't emerged spontaneously. It's not a few student radicals got together, bashed their heads together and decided to launch this campaign. There is an organizational backing to it. So I'm wondering, you published a recent report mapping out the NGOs that have been involved in the Tentifada. Help me understand, who are the main actors there and where are they getting their money from?
Let's start with the Students for Justice for Palestine. They're the most visible. Their name is
innocuous enough.
Certainly, justice is good.
Who doesn't like justice?
And students who can hurt.
Who doesn't love students?
Right. Palestine, one can discuss what that means, but yes, that's the package. And they were actually the first group was founded.
Brilliant branding. It's such brilliant branding.
But we're talking about organization. Branding, yes, plus you add to that organization. So this actually, the first branch was established in my alma mater, Berkeley, in 1993.
I like you less now.
Well, I left, right? Here I am. That was one of the reasons I left, but it was before 1993. In any case, there's a gentleman by the name of Hatam Bazian who has a part-time position there, and his name comes up over and over and over again over the last approximately 30 years. He's sort of a co-founder of the first one, very different. That was supposed to be a dialogue with Jewish students on Zionism, but now obviously it's gone a very different direction. But they've had at least 20 years, not just as a couple of branches at Berkeley in California, but they've had a good 20 years to organize, to have people on various campuses. They claim 300 campuses. What we can see at NGO Monitor is roughly, I'd say, between 80 and 100 that are active. Active, and again, at different levels, but active in the sense of whether they have tents and encampments, whether they have riots and violence, whether they disrupt commencement and classes. Do they have active social media accounts? We have certain categories.
And this is a registered NGO. This isn't an informal movement.
This is not a registered NGO. Their registration is only, well, it's in two areas. One is on individual campuses.
As student societies?
As student societies with that name. And also the ability to get some funding. Perhaps it's all very, very hazy, cloudy, hidden. That's an important point to talk about in a minute. But then there is a national SJP, and the relationships are very, very amorphous. National SJP has some sort of a broader definition, a registration, but it is not registered as a tax-exempt framework to which one can donate and which can pay salaries and all those other aspects of being an NGO, but rather they work with other organizations called fiscal sponsors and may even have salaries paid in that way. It's all very, very hidden. You don't even know how many staff members there are.
I want to try to understand where that money is from. But first, let's understand what this movement has been doing. We often hear from the Palestinian movement the slogan, no justice, no peace. We Israelis want peace. They say they want justice. You ask them, what does justice mean? Let's have a look at what they thought justice meant in October of last year, immediately after the Hamas attack, when SJP published a statement referring, of course, to the acts of beheadings and sexual violence and burnings alive, as today we witness a historic win for the Palestinian resistance across land, air, and sea. Our people have broken down the artificial barriers of the Zionist entity, taking with it the facade of an impenetrable settler colony, taking with it the lives of 1,200 people. That's not something they mentioned there. There seems to be a movement that, operating on American campuses, is all out running interference for Hamas.
I think that's a very accurate description. At the first page, the cover is the toolkit. This is not just a statement of ideology, not just demonizing Israel, praising the murderers, the brutality that took place that day, but in fact, this is a toolkit. And I don't remember how many pages, but it's a multi-page toolkit.
And where
this
are they
is what you
getting the
should
money?
be doing.
And where are they getting the money in order to act on this organized toolkit of how to launch an intifada?
We don't really know. We know a little bit of how the money gets in there. We know that there are various alliances that they have. They know that there's an organization in Westchester County of New York called Westpac, which has a budget, I think, of around $1.5 million, part of which goes to SJP. But that's very amorphous. And it doesn't tell you, as I said, it's a guess as to how much goes where. And we also don't know where the money comes from, which is another aspect. But that's a very small part of the puzzle.
Is this something that American law enforcement is looking into, given that you have organizations that are outright endorsing, glorifying, condoning terrorism?
There's a question of whether this becomes, at what stage does it become material support for terror?
Because, of course, the United States, we have to respect First Amendment, free speech. But you're right, there is a question at what point free speech becomes outright incitement of and glorification of terrorism.
And we saw the presidents of the major universities sitting in front of a congressional committee saying it all depends on the context. Well, we know what the context is. They couldn't. So that is not in terms of the local organizations and the local campuses. They don't want to have to deal with this. They don't want to clash with these very violent and threatening Palestinians and the whole ideological aspect of that goes with it. So there are multiple layers. There are a series of questions that have been raised, most recently by a couple members of Congress. The same member of Congress, Virginia Foxx, who had the hearings with the presidents of the universities on anti-Semitism, has announced that she is going to look into this funding. And I believe a central question will be, when does it become material support for terrorism?
And of course, it's not just in the United States. We're seeing this in campuses around the world. Canada has been a striking, for some people, surprising example. We have here another headline here from an organization called Samidoun, a Canadian registered non-profit who on October 7th, as the massacre was still unfolding, wrote, "As the morning dawns on 7th October 2023, the resistance is rising throughout occupied Palestine, smashing the siege on Gaza with a comprehensive offensive, confronting the occupier by land and air, taking control of Palestinian land." We are, of course, talking about sovereign Israeli territory within the 67 lines, seizing occupation settlers and soldiers. We are, of course, talking about many innocent civilians and children, and launching thousands of missiles as Palestinian resistance forces fight to advance, return, and the liberation of Palestine. By the way, making it perfectly clear here that when these NGOs are talking about liberation, they're not referring to a Palestinian state next to Israel. They are referring to one instead of Israel, and in the name of progressive values, imposing a fascistic Sharia terror organization on the Jews who currently live as free citizens in a liberal democracy. Where did Samidoun come from? Where is it getting its money from to spout its bile and radicalize young Canadians against Israel?
Samidoun is also very active on U.S. campuses. Essentially, politically, on these issues, there's no real border. What happens in Wisconsin or New York or California also happens in Toronto and Montreal, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and elsewhere. And Samidoun is a major piece of that puzzle. The heads of Samidoun now live in Vancouver. And the organization and the individuals, particularly Khaled Barakat, who is the head of and I think founder of Samidoun, spent time in Israeli jail as a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That is a terror organization, according to Israel, of course, but also according to the United States and Europe and Canada.
And his role is what?
He is the head of Samidoun. Samidoun is a part and parcel of the PFLP framework.
And that's not considered illegal under Canadian or American law?
That has not led to them being expelled. Recently, within a year or so, Khaled Barakat had lived in Germany. They have branches in many countries around the world. And Germany was a central part of it. The Germans did not renew his residence visa, to put it mildly. He was expelled. And Samidoun was outlawed. In Brussels, in Belgium, they are now, which is unlikely, you would think that there they'd be much more careful about taking on a PFLP organization because of the political dynamics of Belgium. They're considering outlawing Samidoun. That's been raised and is part of the governmental discussion. So I asked the same question. Why in Canada is Barakat allowed to operate and run this whole network, which we see in many, many of the encampments, many of the, whatever you want, the 10 cities of all the mob places, the support for Hamas. You see semi-dune flags, you see PFLP flags, you see posters. Semi-dune is an integral part. We talked about SJP, but SJP is the visible part of this network. I use the term spaghetti to describe how all these different organizations interact with each other. But semi-dune is certainly an important part of that. And there, I think the terror connection to the PFLP is much more visible. And that has to be raised, and I think is being raised at levels of Congress by members of Parliament. And that may lead to a change because they've been so blatant on this, and you show the text.
I suppose if there's one glimmer of hope from the chaos that we've seen on American campuses, is that decision makers may begin to pay attention to what they have allowed to fester under their noses and grow. Now that it has reached the point of disrupting graduation ceremonies, they will realize there is a threat that they need to deal with. But you know what? The organizations we see on American, Canadian campuses are one thing. I'm actually much more concerned by NGOs, human rights organizations, with their direct involvement in the war in Gaza. Because they have a lot of legitimacy and cachet with names like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And what other organizations have been playing an active role here?
Well, you have Oxfam has been quite active recently. Save the Children. NGO Monitor.
You can't beat a name with Save the Children.
Absolutely. And that's even to have a conversation about whether these organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, there are many organizations like that. By the way, it's important to note these have hundreds of millions of dollars.
And I want to get into the money in a question.
Okay.
And I found as a spokesperson when I was representing the government, impossible to go against someone with a name like Human Rights Watch for Doctors Without Borders when you are giving them as a contra spokesperson for the Prime Minister's office of the State of Israel. But these are organizations that enjoy international legitimacy because of their activities around the world, even though in this specific conflict, to me at least, it is clear that they are clear political actors with an agenda. Would it be fair, do you think, to say that in the information war that Israel is fighting against Hamas, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the other human rights organizations have made themselves active combatants in that information war against Israel?
These organizations, somewhat to a greater or lesser degree, but they have been doing this. They have been participating, active participants in the political war. There is the terror war that takes place, and there's the political war. The first time that really became visible, and I'm not going to give you my 3-hour dissertation on this, you'll have to sign up for the class for that, read the books, but in 2000, if you remember, there was what was called the Jenin Massacre of 2002. It came after horrendous suicide bombings, Pesach and the Park Hotel and other things, which many of us remember. And both Amnesty and Human Rights Watch came out with declarations which basically cut and paste from the Palestinian propaganda that went on CNN, went on the BBC, and said there was a massacre.
And for those who don't remember, remind us what the allegations were and what actually happened.
The allegation was that the IDF went in after there were a series of horrendous bombings, went into Jenin, the refugee camp, and committed a massacre in which first they said hundreds of Palestinians were killed. The Amnesty spokesperson, the reason I want to go into this is because I remember it so vividly. The Amnesty spokesperson, who was nowhere near Jenin, went on the BBC and said, I can confirm that there was a massacre. And immediately when the BBC has a broadcast with an Amnesty expert, nobody can contradict it. Of course, there was no massacre. There wasn't any significant killing of civilians. There were a number of Israelis, I think over 20 Israelis were killed in the operation. It was not bombed from the air, but on the ground. It was a turning point because it meant taking back those areas which were centers for Palestinian terror. It was a mini version of what we're seeing now in Gaza.
A mini version of what we're seeing, and so I wonder if we fast forward to what we've been seeing since October 7th. And as a spokesperson, I so often had to engage with, well, Amnesty says this, Doctors Without Borders says this, UNICEF says that. How would you summarize the role of the international human rights industry ecosystem in the information war, in the propaganda war, in that political war against Israel that's been running concurrent to the actual fighting on the ground?
All these organizations have at least a 20-year history and experience in running that propaganda war. They know exactly what language to use, and the the role of international law and human rights principles for them is basically ammunition. And they have used it, twisted it, lied about it consistently.
Can you give me an example?
Well, the example of jumping from 2002 in Jenin to now, the casualty claims. Israel, the UN cuts and pastes from what's called the Hamas or the Gaza Ministry of Health.
In their defense, the UN puts a little asterisk and writes at the bottom, we cannot independently confirm these figures. But of course, none of the reporters who say the UN said quote the caveat.
But then the NGOs, all these NGOs, cut and paste, put those numbers in and give them legitimacy without the caveat, without the asterisk. And then they use terms like disproportionality, indiscriminate killing of children. They go through step by step everything they can to demonize Israel, and they erase. The hostages are all gone from them. That's not human rights. They erase the Israelis who were killed. They erase every aspect of this. They erase 20,000 plus, I think, maybe more rockets.
Try to help me understand how they regard their mission. Do these organizations believe we are warriors for human rights, we believe in international law for all, and that leads them to wage an information war against Israel? Or do they regard their role as being to support the Palestinian narrative and to blacken Israel as part of a conscious political campaign? I'm trying to understand how much of this is in good faith.
The NGO industry, the human rights, particularly aspect of that industry, generally is attractive to people, brings in people and gives them opportunities, including large salaries for many of them, to promote what's called a post-colonial or anti-Western, anti-capitalist political ideological agenda. Let's start with it. That's the big picture. If I go back to Ken Roth, who ran Human Rights Watch for almost 30 years, and now is at Princeton teaching students, even though he has no academic credentials.
God help them. No, because his involvement, especially on Twitter, has been especially vile with the lies.
There's a personal aspect to that, but let's start with the ideological aspect of that from the 1960s. And there's also for him, and the same thing is true for Agnes Callamard at Amnesty, and there are many, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but it's like a magnet. All those who have this deep chip on their shoulder or much greater than that perspective, in a lot of ways it's Stalinism and Marxism from the 1950s, in which a central element of that is anti-Israelism. Not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Israelism. And I'll take the opportunity,
by the way, to say, whoever has not already watched the episode we recorded with Isabella Tabarovsky about the Soviet origins of modern anti-Zionism, skip back on YouTube or wherever else you get your podcasts, and you'll be briefed in more detail.
So these people, the heads of these organizations, and I remind you, Human Rights Watch has an annual budget of $100 million a year to promote this ideology consistently. And Israel is the easiest and the most visible target. So in addition to their ideology, they want to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva to do a press conference with the head or the special rapporteur, let's say, of the Human Rights Council now, a woman by the name of Francesca Albanese, who has an Italian with a deep history of the combination of the anti-Western, anti-capitalist ideology and Catholic anti-Semitism.
Everyone's favorite unrepentant anti-Semite.
Absolutely. But they work together. They use exactly the same methods, the same lines, the same language. So it's a combination. Israel is the term that is often used. Israel is the arrowhead of the Western penetration of the Middle East. And they go back through historically. So I see this, and I traced it in the language that was used when Ken Roth was not as much of an obsessive, pathological hater of Israel back 20, 25 years ago. But the anti-Westernism, the post-colonialism was very much there. And you see this also in all the other people in the organizations that I mentioned. They come in with a chip on their shoulder.
You say post-colonialism, but we should say this is pseudo-post-colonialism.
Yes.
Because there is nothing particularly anti-colonial about fighting for the side of Hamas against the only state that has successfully decolonized the Middle East by restoring an indigenous people to their ancestral land against the face of attempts to reimpose an Islamic empire. But these are huge sums of money. Where is the money coming from?
Some of it is known, and that's relatively easy to discuss. Let's take Human Rights Watch. a lot of their money comes from wealthy foundations and individual donors with a lot of money. They hold these fancy dinners in various major cities. They have a large part of their staff is just devoted to fundraising and PR to get themselves on the platforms so that people will see them as the experts and pay them. Amnesty is harder. Amnesty is based in the UK, and they have 3 different financial or legal entities, and it's a bit of a shell game to figure out who's funding them. Some of their money comes from governments. And then we have what we don't know, and all these, it applies to all these organizations in different ways. But what we don't know, for instance, Human Rights Watch said they sent somebody out in 2009. It's a long story by Sarah Leah Whitston. She went to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. She gave a talk. She raised money, or she said she didn't raise money. Turned out that there is at least $470,000 she got from a corrupt Saudi billionaire. And then we see this leak of material that the Qatar government gave them 3 million euros in 2018 as additional money. In other words, there's money that's hidden. I think in Human Rights Watch, it's probably less than 20%, just because we more or less can track the other 80, but it's hidden, it's offshore. Amnesty, we have no idea. And then there are all these other groups.
Are they receiving governmental funding?
Amnesty receives European government funding, as does Oxfam.
What about Middle Eastern regimes?
That is hidden, and again, it's from leaks that we know.
Hidden but exists, or hidden and we speculate?
Some of it we exist because it's been leaked. Some of it is speculated. Internal, I guess whistleblowers is the right term.
And where is this money coming from?
The 2 examples we have are the ones from Saudi Arabia, or a Saudi corrupt businessman, and Qatar. They also gave in 2009...
Sorry, Qatar and Saudi have been funding who?
Human Rights Watch, according to the documents that have been released.
And Human Rights Watch sees no contradiction in taking money from brutal, repressive regimes and at the same time...
They just hide it.
I mean, Saudi Arabia has improved its own record, but I mean, this isn't exactly shimmering
This was back in 2011, and it was a billionaire who was himself condemned by Human Rights Watch. It's a very shady business. A lot of these are. But again, these were hidden. They were leaked internally. There was a review, according to the article, the media article, where it was leaked. There was a review by the board, and they reprimanded, but they took no action against any individuals, and it was rubber stamped. So, and then they avoid talking about it.
I can imagine what these governments' interests might be, but you said that they spend a huge amount of money doing fundraising. And so I'm wondering to what extent they are fundraising based on a promise to protect vulnerable people around the world, and then take it, hijack it, and use that money to wage propaganda campaigns against Israel, or is the promise of waging a war of delegitimization against Israel what helps them raise money? Are people giving money to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch because they want to see them turn Israel into a pariah state?
Let's start by saying that since we do not have full records of major donors, it's hard for us to tell. And I think that's a major hole in the process.
Are they not required to be transparent about?
No, they're not. And that is a serious issue. But beyond that, when they raise this money, I receive every week, at least once a week, from Human Rights Watch, a newsletter and a request for funding. I'm not sure what name I registered under.
I think we have a scoop here that Human Rights Watch is asking Professor Gerald Steinberg for money.
Everybody can sign up to see. And there are almost none of those newsletters and requests for funding talk about their work on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is their primary. Of all the countries in the world, they put more, I once counted pages and number of documents that they put out, news releases, major reports. It's the number one, sometimes tied with some other area, maybe now with Ukraine and Russia.
So you're actually seeing a gulf between
what happens
where they dedicate their work and actually where they dedicate their sales pitch.
And I've talked to people who have either given large amounts of money or have been requested to give large amounts of money. You get invited to a very fancy dinner, you're given the spotlight, the fundraising machine is extremely well oiled, but you don't really know what's going on because you're new at this business. You made a lot of money or you inherited a lot of money, made it in the high-tech area, whatever, and you want the legitimacy, the visibility of being one of the good and the great of the world by giving money to a well-established, highly respected human rights organization.
And that moral authority is part of what makes challenging these organizations so difficult for Israel. It's not NGOs here and there. It's a whole ecosystem that has been weaponized and mobilized. And so I'm wondering what you see the options as being for Israel, supporters of Israel, to fight back against this ecosystem. Is it a question of trying to discredit them? Is it a question of trying to build a parallel ecosystem of think tanks and NGOs that will offer a rival picture? How does one begin to confront the damage that is done by organizations with such moral authority in their names, waging a conscious political war against Israel?
The correct answer is all of the above.
And more.
And more. And then it becomes a question of prioritizing. And one of the holes in my history is I failed to convince Israeli decision makers or Jewish leaders, particularly in the United States, Britain, elsewhere, to take this seriously and to strategically go through the steps that can be taken, each one of the ones that you mentioned.
So here I'm giving you a platform because we will have many people within the Jewish leadership world who are asking, how do we take the fight to these organizations that have been weaponized against Israel? What would you say to people who are looking to distribute funding and philanthropy to helping improve Israel's name? What do they do about the NGO ecosystem problem?
I'll start with the first item I think you mentioned, discredit them. And that requires a significant amount of investment of time and expertise. To discredit an organization that puts out reports and press releases almost every day, or social media tweets which are outrageous and are lies, you need to have a team that's able to, in the same coin, respond and show that these are lies. I don't want to sound like I'm undercutting my own organization. That's why
Isn't that what you're meant to be doing?
NGO Monitor, I have spent the last 20 years of a 3-year project, at least half my time, and a wonderful group of dedicated people who work with me, about 15 of us, based in Jerusalem, but countering, discrediting, and exposing the funders. We'll get to that in a second. But discrediting is a major part of it. I think that there should be an operation like this in every major country that should take these organizations that are based there and systematically respond, not on a one-off, and there's some people who've done some excellent work, but generally one-off, and then they go on to something else. But dedicated until you really make a dent in the reputation of this organization. Just one quick side comment. A woman by the name of Danielle Haas, who worked for Human Rights Watch, I believe, for 13 years as a senior editor. A few months ago, she became a whistleblower relatively shortly after October 7th. She said, basically, in my words, not hers, she can't take it anymore, that the hypocrisy and the anti-Semitism and the lack of professionalism altogether was a major part of what Human Rights Watch was doing specifically on Israel, because it was singled out. More than not on China, not on other countries, but particularly Israel, for all the reasons that we've talked about. What she exposed, and others to a lesser degree, should be something that should be used constantly every time when Human Rights Watch has a major dinner in Toronto. It's like the Met Gala in New York and whatever the equivalent is in London, that there should be not just a group of people picketing, but every person who goes there should be confronted with the reality of what they are funding. I found the donors that I've spoken to had no idea, because they got the newsletters, they got the pitch, and it wasn't about it. And many of them are Jewish. It was about, we're saving the world, human rights. And they don't have the time, the bandwidth, and Human Rights Watch hides it from them.
You know, one of the things that surprised me in the course of this war, I'll admit I was a little bit surprised. Not the way that they have been covering up how Hamas has been stealing aid and operating out of hospitals. By the way, going against their own legal advice from when ISIS was operating out of hospitals in Iraq, and it was clear that Western states, the international coalition, had a right to go after them. Suddenly, when Hamas operates out of hospitals in Gaza, these organizations want you to think that that gives them immunity because terrorists are hiding in the basement of a hospital, and they're doing immense damage to Palestinians on the ground by covering that up. One of the things that surprised me is the basic lack of empathy for the Israeli victims of October 7th. We have here an example from Amnesty International, which, to its credit, has demanded that Hamas release the hostages. It has released rather dry statements demanding a release of the hostages, but it hasn't exactly run a campaign showing their faces. Here is the one tweet, the only tweet from Amnesty International, I had to double check this, showing faces of hostages, showed that of 2 Thai hostages, who of course, their lives are worth exactly the same as all the other hostages and must be released as well, but not the same campaign showing the faces of the hostages, the hashtag bring them home, and I'm wondering why. Why is it so difficult for them to say, we support human rights, therefore we're going to run an active campaign demanding a release of the hostages? Why is it lip service?
First of all, their entire support base, I'm not talking about the funders primarily, but I'm talking, although to some degree Amnesty has that, is very much involved in the support of the Palestinian cause. For them, Israel is the absolute evil. Israel uses all these terrible weapons, and Palestinians, yes, there are some bad eggs, they may, or bad apples, whatever the term that the UN has used, UNRWA in particular. But by and large, the vast majority of Palestinians are victims, and Israelis are aggressors. That is an image which is so deeply embedded. That's part of the ideology, which has been around for 20 years, so you don't ask the question.
But clearly the Bibas children who were abducted are not oppressors. Anyone can see that. So why is it so difficult to show their faces and say, let them go?
Because, first of all, I don't know that they even bother to look at the faces. They probably turn away and nobody puts it in front of them and says, look at these people.
Because it's psychological cognitive dissonance, because they know that it actually strengthens Israel's case for prosecuting this war?
They view, from the beginning to the end, Israel as the oppressor, as the superpower, and Palestinians as powerless victims. That's really the agenda or the image that they've had since 1948. It wasn't when Amnesty was established in the early 60s, Human Rights Watch in the mid-70s, but the image of Palestinians as perpetual victims from 1948, you're getting to the broader aspects, but the NGOs are very much part of that process. Not at the beginning. At the beginning, they weren't. By the way, it's important to say this. When Amnesty was established for release of political prisoners, this Middle East issues, Israel, Palestinians, Palestine wasn't even a term in those days, was not on their agenda at all.
Amnesty is founded in order to secure a release of political prisoners. Now you have Amnesty demanding an immediate ceasefire that would leave Hamas on its feet, and they're demanding an amnesty for Hamas rapists.
There's a complete disconnect between the principles that Amnesty was founded on and that Human Rights Watch was founded on, and their actions and their agendas and their priorities today. A total disconnect. They were taken over. That's another important point that comes in the 14-week course. The ease with which NGOs are subject to takeover. They're targets for takeover by very, I would say fanatics is a good term, people who have this ideological capability or aspect and have the ability to raise massive amounts of fund, which overwhelms. People go into NGOs, they found them, they retire, they move on, and then they become targets for these type of very intense political warriors, propagandists, and that's what we see in all of these organizations, and they're able to raise a lot of money.
And what are you doing about that as NGO Monitor, apart from the 14-week course, to which we'll provide a link for those who are interested in learning more in the description of the episode? What are you doing as NGO Monitor to try to call out
go back to your 3 or 4 aspects of how do you fight, how do you counter this political campaign. Starting with the NGOs, it involves the UN and every place else. So we start with discrediting. To the extent possible, we get overwhelmed because you can't do all of the reports. We counter, we show that the reports that they write have no evidentiary foundations. They lie, or they use completely false and unverifiable sources.
Do you think they know that? I mean, is this?
Yes, they know that.
Faith?
They know that. At least some of them do, because I know from inside sources that have told us they have these committees that, or at least Human Rights Watch does, to deal with counter reports from NGO Monitor, and how do they deal with that? The second element, which is equally important, in some ways harder, is to confront the donors, to try to cut off the flow of the millions of dollars and euros and pounds that go to these organizations, whether it's from within their countries where they are registered as tax-exempt charities, and Amnesty in the UK, Amnesty International, Amnesty UK, and there's a third variation, are charities subject to Charity Commission oversight. We've also gone to the Charity Commission, us and others.
Any luck?
Not really. A small slap on the wrist occasionally. They're much more powerful. The organizations, Amnesty is so much more powerful. As one former charity commissioner said to me, than any of the political even during a period of Tory control, Tory government for many years, they have not been able to really confront Amnesty. But I think it's doable. There have been some significant donors from Human Rights Watch who I've managed to be able to get a half an hour to sit with, and I've been able to, first was 15 minutes, present real information, and one they had never seen before, and they pulled their money. And sometimes it is one, and that leads to another and a third. Very often it's people from Jewish backgrounds who are aware. This is not now, this was back 10, 15 years ago. Now it should be much stronger.
Justice, justice, you shall pursue is the core of Jewish ethos.
The wheels of justice also run very slowly, but they grind very finely. It takes a long time to do this.
Professor Steinberg, I mean, you'll be familiar with the criticism of NGO Monitor. How would you summarize it?
The easiest way to ignore the research that we do, and everything is open source, everything is verifiable, is to label us as a group of right-wing fanatics and to lump us in a political framework which allows them to simply ignore and silence us. We see that from governments. I had a meeting with a European ambassador. It took a while to organize, I and my colleagues, a few days ago. And the first thing that he or she said was, and they read off a piece of paper that identified us in the context of the Israeli political left-right divide and put us into a corner. Now, he took the meeting—
The right-wing corner.
Very far right-wing corner. He took the meeting because I had run into him at an event at the president's house, and I had spoken to the president visibly, therefore, I must not be so crazy right-wing. And it's things like that. So the best way to deal with it— some are, some are not. The Swedish government provides us NGO funding through a major international development group, SIDA, S-I-D-A. They had an in-house magazine that for a number of issues featured me with a picture of a spider web, me and NGO Monitor, where as if I was controlling Mr. Netanyahu, the entire Israeli government, and the American government, and the American ambassador to Israel, and all these other— it was an anti-Semitic
full-on Jewish octopus.
But it was because, why? Because we were raising questions that forced the Swedish government and a number of other European governments to temporarily stop funding for Palestinian NGOs that are affiliated with the PFLP. It wasn't just Semi-Dun, there's a whole network under human rights. So the easiest way is to simply to label us in this way and therefore not even bother to deal with the information. The counter to that—
But the question of who guards the guardians is a question so old that the original form was in Latin, right?
Yes, it was.
There is a serious question.
Yes.
Quis custodiet custodias. There is a serious question about, you claim to be monitoring the NGOs. Well, who's actually supposed to hold you to account? Because otherwise you can come and simply bash anyone you don't like as being lying, automatically anti-Israel.
Eylon, I invite you and anybody else who's watching this, who's somewhat questioning the veracity of what we do, the verifiability, the credibility, to take anything we've published and go through it, because everything has a link to the original source. You can check it yourself. We have been attacked. We have been labeled. The one thing that's never happened is to be demonstrated that we have said something incorrect. There have been some lawsuits that have tried to do that, but they have never succeeded because we are very, very careful to make sure— I'm an academic, but it's not only that, it's about credibility. I know that if I take on Human Rights Watch—
An academic, but not of the plagiarizing sort.
An early, old school academic, right. One of the major events that happened in the history of Human Rights Watch was that the founder, Robert Bernstein, the late founder, Robert Bernstein, wrote an article in the New York Times in 2009 denouncing Human Rights Watch for having lost its moral compass and turning Israel into a pariah state. I sat with Robert Bernstein for a number of times over a couple of years going through the information. He was willing— first he said, "Young man, I'll give you 5 minutes." He was in his late 70s and I was younger in those days. But he gave me 15, and then later on, a couple of months later, gave me half a day with members of the board. So there's an example. He also gave a number of speeches at universities where he got human rights awards to use that as a platform to denounce the organization run by Ken Roth, which he had lost control of because he had retired. Why am I telling you all this? Because there are individuals who will listen to the information. He said to me, "I was told that everything you say is incorrect," or maybe even he used stronger language than that. But when I showed him clearly, and he could check it himself, and he had staff members who went and looked to check the internet links and other reports, they saw that everything that was there was correct, that what they had written and said was invented, false, or simply quoted sources that could not be verified. Palestinian eyewitnesses, this is important. Many of these NGO reports quote eyewitnesses or journalist reports, none of which can be verified, or quote UN agencies like the number of Palestinian casualties in Gaza that we see, or the number of children. The UN gets it from the Gaza Ministry of Health.
Which is, of course, Hamas.
So it's all smoke and mirrors.
Professor Steinberg, before we wrap up, I want to play a game with you. And that game is called Guess What They Were Tweeting on October 7th. We have some of the first tweets that so-called human rights organizations were tweeting as the massacre was still unfolding. If it was a few days later, it was while Hamas terrorists were still being smoked out of the kibbutzim. Let's start with Amnesty International. 11:30 p.m. on October 7th. Don't look behind your shoulder. Guess what they were tweeting?
I would guess, and I've looked at these, by the way, at best, they were saying both sides need to exercise caution and take their actions in accordance with international law and human rights practices.
Ding, 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 ding. The tweet, in fact, says Israeli security forces and Palestinian armed groups must make every effort to protect the lives of civilians in today's outbreak of fighting in Israel, which is a very strange way to describe the Hamas invasion of Einsatzgruppen with GoPros trying to murder people as possible. Now, it wasn't just a tweet, there was a link to a statement, which of course refers to Hamas terrorists as fighters, expresses deep alarm about mounting civilian death tolls.
This is on October 7th.
This is 11:30 p.m. on October 7th, and their response to the atrocities is to say Israel has a horrific track record of committing war crimes with immunity. Palestinian armed groups must refrain from targeting civilians and using indiscriminate weapons. Fair enough, as they have done in the past, and most intensively in this event, acts amounting to war crimes, but the focus there, even as the attack is ongoing and Israel is trying to save people from their houses, is to talk about Israel's track record of committing war crimes. Even before talking about the massacre, and the death toll was lower than we realized at the time, they condemned Israel's retaliatory attack in Gaza. Perhaps what shocked me most about this statement was it said, you know, you have to address the root causes of these repeated cycles of violence. And you might have said, okay, address the root causes. Hamas must abandon its violent ideology of eliminating Israel from the river to the sea. But no, it requires upholding international law, ending Israel's 16-year illegal blockade on Gaza imposed to stop Hamas from rearming, and all other aspects of Israel's system of apartheid imposed on Palestinians. And essentially you have a statement here that says, okay, Hamas shouldn't be targeting civilians, but the root cause is Israel.
All the language is from Durban, September 2001. That was the beginning of we are going to undermine Israel's legitimacy using the tools of South Africa, of the fight against apartheid in South Africa, just transferring them. Anthony Julius made that observation very shortly afterwards. They took all their trophies and statements against the apartheid regime in South Africa and simply moved them on to Israel. So you see all that language in that one statement from October.
Well, you passed
7th.
round one. Let's move to round two. The first post by Human Rights Watch on Twitter came on October 9th. Can you guess what it said?
I would guess it had very similar language about both sides. Maybe a little bit sharper, might have even had the word apartheid in it, not in a longer statement, but in the original tweet. But
you are very good. Actually, it was in the longer statement, not the tweet. The tweet itself was a statement from one of their experts saying, their atrocities do not justify your atrocities. The brutality of their war crimes does not lessen the brutality of your war crimes. Again, unable to simply say, we unequivocally condemn Hamas for the brutal acts of sexual violence and beheading people and burning whole families alive. And again, in the full statement, this is all still online, talking about Israel's systematic oppression. It says, you know, does this years-long inhuman repression justify brutal attacks by Palestinian armed groups? No, never. Good. It may be part of the background. It's not an excuse, definitely relevant. But again, you have that inability to simply say, guys, Palestinians, you got it wrong this time.
And it's inability. It's not a choice. It's something that's deeply embedded in the organizational culture. It's that statement, particularly that Danielle Haas, when she sent an email around to all the employees of Human Rights Watch saying, I can't do this anymore, she quoted that and exactly those points.
Let's move to round 3. Save the Children, October 9th. I want you to guess whether the tweet, in fact, demanded the return of the Bibas children and the other 30 children or so abducted as hostages, yes or no?
No.
Very good guess. It wasn't really a difficult question. It's a statement here saying,
there's a pattern here.
Save the Children has been providing essential services and support to Palestinian children impacted by the ongoing conflict since 1953 and has had a permanent presence in the occupied Palestinian territory since 1973. We are present in the West Bank and Gaza. Looks like it was written by a fax machine married with ChatGPT. Let's have a look. Round 4, UNICEF. Can you guess how they responded immediately
Probably
after
the
October
suffering
7th?
of Palestinian children.
Well, they actually said they were deeply concerned for the well-being of children in Israel and the state of Palestine. So they're monitoring the situation for reports of grave violations committed against children. Of course, nothing there explicitly about the Hamas atrocities, as if there's been another outbreak of fighting, ignoring Hamas's massive, unprecedented, brutal attack. Finally, round 5, Oxfam, which, for those who don't know, runs charity shops the length and breadth of Britain. You go into a charity shop, you buy an old sweater or a blazer, and you contribute money to Oxfam. It's one of the most pristine charities.
If this was more than 24, 48 hours after
October
the massacre,
9th.
October 9th, probably mostly condemning Israel for the actions that were taken immediately afterwards, shutting off fuel supplies, other threats against the Palestinian, innocent Palestinian civilians.
You are so good, I'm beginning to wonder whether my producer here has
I've
leaked
read
my
these
notes
things,
to you
unfortunately.
in anticipation. It's Oxfam's Najla Shawa describing to BBC News the situation in Gaza as an airstrike hits out of the sky for no reason at all. We have no electricity, and this affects access to water. How would you, when you were reading these statements on October 7th, give me in a sentence, surprised, shocked, or it was so obvious that they would fail to offer this basic sympathy for the Israeli citizens being slaughtered by Hamas death squads?
I would use the term disgust, absolute disgust. My stomach turned over because for all the reasons you cited, we all know people who were murdered brutally, and we were beginning, I don't remember exactly at what date we realized which people that we knew had been slaughtered in this. And we were still sorting, as Israelis, we were sorting this, but also as individuals, and dealing with this tremendous shock. And these were the kind of statements, disgusting statements, that no human warmth, no human sympathy or empathy at all for Israelis. And that's when the term anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, comes in. If you, in your position as a humanitarian...
That's a strong allegation.
sourcer,
Are you saying that Human Rights Watch is an anti-Semitic organization?
yes, and not just me. That's what people who've worked there have
Amnesty
said.
International?
Yes, there are
UNICEF?
individuals there. I go through the entire list. There's a difference between individuals and the organization, and it's a hard point to decide upon. But certainly major individuals who set policy, particularly on Israeli-Palestinian issues or Palestinian issues. The inability to see Israelis as humans, as victims, the Bibas children, any children, and their parents, the number of orphans who saw in front of them their parents being slaughtered. I'm not going to go through all of that. We've been through all of that. But the fact that these are the people who claim a moral mandate, whose entire lives and careers are based on that claim of being moral, act so entirely immoral. That is what really, in many ways, I find the most disturbing and disgusting.
And perhaps not surprising when you are wedded to a vision of the world in which morality is judged by your victim status, to say, and the victim is always right, to admit that Israeli children, young festival goers, were in fact the victims, would be to say that they have some moral superiority, that they are right. And in order to deny that they're right, you have to deny that they're victims. In order to deny that they're victims, you have to deny their humanity and simply gloss over these atrocities or do this both sides.
Erase them. You erase them. They do not exist. And that's what we see with, I think, one minor exception, which, by the way, I don't remember being repeated. And the flood, I'm not sure that's the right term, of posts by UNICEF since then. Almost all, maybe all of them, are about the suffering of Palestinian children.
And not a single campaign putting the faces of Israeli children abducted and trying to fight their corner. Professor Gerald Steinberg, an enlightening episode about the role that the human rights industry and NGO ecosystem plays in political and legal warfare against Israel. A pleasure having you on State of a Nation. Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation with my guest, Gerald Steinberg from NGO Monitor. As always, if you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And we'll be back soon with more episodes that take you beyond the headlines and between the lines. I'm Eylon Levy, and thank you for joining us.